Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Autism Spectrum Disorder with Katie Doctor. My name is Danielle Daly. I'm the Professional Development Coordinator here with the Illinois Crisis Prevention Network. I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping things and then Katie will get started. Everyone is muted and your cameras are disabled. Please use that chat box in order to interact throughout the presentation. I know that Katie's going to be asking you to interact throughout. You can also ask questions within there or ask questions in the Q&A so those don't get lost in the chat box because I know there's going to be a lot of stuff going on in there. Please visit our website, icpn.org. You can view all of our upcoming trainings or review past ones. You can also sign up to receive our future mailings to be the first to know of all of the new upcoming webinars that we have going on. CEs, give me about 14 days to get those out to everyone. They will come to the email that you registered with. So by clicking on the link today, you are accounted for. And your CE will come to the email address that you registered with. So be on the lookout for that. If for some reason you don't receive that in that 14-day time period, then after the fact, please send me an email. I will put my email address into the chat box here in a little while, but it is ddaily@hope.us. As I said, if you don't receive it, please reach out to me after that 14-day time period. It does take me quite a little bit of time to get those out to everyone. I think that is all I have. So Katie, if you want to go ahead and get started.
Sure. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. I appreciate you being here. I don't know what the weather is like where you're at, but here in Springfield, it is around 85 degrees and sunny. So I know being inside on a day like today can be a little tough, especially with a long weekend for some of us coming up. I know that a lot of people are hoping to maybe sneak out a little early this week, and I can't blame you at all. But before we get to that, we are going to talk about autism spectrum disorders today. And excuse me, I want to go ahead and let everybody know that there's far more information out there than what I have in this presentation. And there will be parts of this presentation that I very quickly gloss over so that we can get to the things that I think are probably going to be the most helpful for all of you today in working with the individuals that you serve. But if anybody has any specific areas they'd like me to cover or questions, do not hesitate to put them in that webinar chat box. I can either answer those questions right away or let you know that I will be covering them or point you in the direction of some other resources. This is a very, very broad topic. It is one that I don't think any of us will ever truly be able to honestly consider ourselves to be experts in. And it's an area that's really changing and still very much evolving. So what we're talking about today is today's information, but as science evolves, there might be more information out there later. So certainly this is a training that will change over time. But a little quick background information about me. I have worked in the school system for a number of years as a specialist in school psychology, and then I'm also a BCBA. I've worked for Hope now for, 13 years or so. I've worked in the group homes, evening and weekends as a BCBA. I ran the Springfield office of ICPN for 10 years. And for the last almost year, I have been our Director of Quality Assurance here at Hope for all of our clinical programs. So I've seen a lot of stuff, done a lot of things, and have a little bit of information about autism. So let's talk about what our plan is for today. We're going to talk about what are autism spectrum disorders. We're going to talk a bit about the diagnostic criteria, some of the signs and the symptomology that you might see. Autism myths and facts, because I think that's really important to talk about. Characteristics of ASDs, therapies, and then some practical strategies as well. If anytime I happen to mention ASD, that's just short for autism spectrum disorders, just so we're all on the same page with that. So first thing, what in the heck are autism spectrum disorders? If we don't know what they are, how are we supposed to talk about them today? I think the first thing to know is that they are a group of neurologically based developmental disabilities. And autism spectrum disorders is a wide range. And we're going to talk all about that because if you've met the sort of the tagline for a lot of autism support groups is if you've met one person with autism, you've only met one person with autism. So this one diagnosis isn't a very clear delineated sort of pathway that a person's life will lead, which is great. ASDs can impact a person's functioning across a wide range, anywhere from mild to very severe differences in how they They view the world and interact with the world. And it really is that wide of a range. They can cause significant social, communication, and behavior challenges, but those things aren't necessarily always going to be present. And some of those things are going to be more significant than others, depending on the individual person. ASDs are present during early childhood and last throughout a person's life. So it's not as if it's a diagnosis that you're suddenly going to get at a certain age that's a little bit later in life, something along the lines of, let's say, dementia or some sort of memory loss, where we expect that after a person's lived to a certain, level of years. That's not the way it works with autism at all. So let's talk about diagnostic criteria for just a minute. I am assuming that most of you who are on the presentation today are residential managers, QIDPs. I think I saw a director earlier, or some CEOs, or just staff who are working with individuals. And I'm also making a big assumption here that most of you are working with adult populations. If there is anyone here who works primarily with little kids, don't hesitate to say so, because certainly some of the information that I'll focus on might be a little bit different. And I'm seeing a lot of individuals who work for adult facilities, which is great. The diagnostic criteria, and this is per the DSM-5. And I want to talk about the DSM a little bit. Okay, thank you, Clifton. That's great to know. What we're going to look for when you are looking at diagnostics is some of these criteria. And this is a quick snapshot of some of what's in the DSM-5, and certainly not all of it. But you're going to be looking for deficits in social communication and interaction across multiple contexts. And that multiple context piece is really, really important. It's either manifested through history, or it's something that the person is experiencing right now. They may also have restrictive and repetitive movements, patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. And those are not always what we would consider to be necessarily biological age appropriate. The symptoms must be present in early developmental periods, but we may not actually notice them until the individual gets a bit older. Sometimes those differences aren't really noticed until someone is closer to the age of 3 or closer to school age. Those things don't necessarily manifest to people who are not trained experts in the area. What we have seen is there's actually been some research done with experts in the area who are able to look at very old videos of people who later carry the diagnosis. And what we're finding is you can actually see signs that could point to a later diagnosis as early as 3 months, which I think is very, very interesting. Just that we're really getting an understanding that this really is a true developmental disability that is present basically from birth. The symptoms can cause clinically significant impairment in social skills, occupational skills, and other really important areas of functioning. And the last part here is really about rule out diagnoses, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more as well. But you want to be sure that there's nothing else going on with that person that really better explains what it is that is happening with them or how they are experiencing the world. We want to be sure that we are always looking at all of the diagnostic possibilities so that we can best get individuals the services and the help that they actually need. So if within the DSM-5, okay, Robin, that is a great question. We can talk about that a bit later on, definitely. Within autism spectrum disorder and the DSM-5, you have the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, which covers a wide range of potential difficulties. But then you also want to look at differential diagnosis, things like Rett syndrome, selective mutism, which is when you might have an individual who is making it an actual choice to not speak, as opposed to maybe someone who lacks the skill set or doesn't have the right skill set to be able to communicate in a verbal or a vocal manner that we would typically consider to be more developmentally appropriate. We also just want to rule out any sort of language disorders and communication disorders. Intellectual disability without autism spectrum disorder. One of the things that I think can be a bit misleading within the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder is that you do not have to have an intellectual disability to have a diagnosis of ASD. An intellectual disability and ASD are two different things. You also want to look at someone and just ensure they don't have some sort of stereotypic movement disorder, something like Tourette's or some sort of tics that explain everything that's happening with them, ADHD as well. And then also rule out schizophrenia, which schizophrenia isn't super common in children. Typically we see that start to really manifest itself closer to someone in their 20s. But there are some cases of childhood schizophrenia, and we want to rule those things out as well. So let's talk about a diagnosis and really the importance of it, or if I'm being very honest, in the adult world, maybe the not benefit or the lack of true benefits of a diagnosis. For children, massive benefits, massive. If you have a child that you are interacting with or that is your child, anything along those lines, and you have any level of concern or curiosity about whether or not they are on the autism spectrum, I strongly encourage you to get an evaluation, to talk to doctors, to really get that information, because as a child, there are just so many resources that are out there. And all of the research that we really have at this point in time indicates the sooner we can work with children and the more intense those services, typically the better their outcomes long term. So with a child, you're going to get a greater level of educational support, of resources, and of therapies. There are a number of things that once you have a diagnosis of ASD that can actually get covered throughout people's insurances that really, really help families so that they can actually get the services for their loved one that they need to be successful. In fact, within the school system, autism is within itself its own educational disability. You can get an IEP with that. So that's great to know. So you can get OT and PT and speech language services and ABA therapy and all sorts of things that could be covered as a child once you have a diagnosis. But when you get to the adult world, it's a really different perspective. It's a very, very different sort of ballgame at that point. The biggest benefit that I see, and certainly everyone here is allowed to have a very different opinion, but the biggest benefit that I see when we are working with adults, understanding who they are, that's where the diagnosis really becomes helpful. And I think if we look at ourselves and times where we didn't feel like we were fitting in, right? Or we were having some social difficulties. If you had a diagnosis, it might help sort of put a name to what you're experiencing so you don't feel as alone. And so you have a better understanding of who you are. So that is the number one reason for adults why a diagnosis might be helpful. But the reality is this, diagnoses, there's a lot of things they don't really help with when you are specifically talking about ASD in adults. And the first one is a diagnosis does not change someone's behaviors or their skill set, right? It's very, very simple. Behaviors and symptoms lead doctors to a diagnosis. It's not the other way around. So the diagnosis itself isn't going to change the individual. We shouldn't assume that. It's not going to change their behaviors or anything else about them. And specifically for ASD, it does not produce greater access to medications, which is a significant reason that a lot of times we are looking at actually getting people diagnosed accurately, is because certain medications are only accessed with certain diagnoses, and those medications can make a tremendous impact on someone's life. And I want to be clear, I am not a medication pusher by any means. I like to ride that fine line between medications can take the edge off so that you can provide the other work and the other therapy that people need to live their best possible life. But the reality is there are no medications out there. They're actually approved to treat autism. So the diagnosis itself does not get you access to greater medications. So all of those things make it a little bit less appealing as an adult to focus on that diagnosis. Not to say, though, that it's not important to get, because it might be for the individual themselves that you are working with. It might make them feel like they have a better idea of who they are, why they feel the way they feel, and it might help them access potentially maybe a support group or something along those lines. But most of the benefits truly are for children, which is a bit unfortunate for those of us who work primarily in the adult world. But I think as time goes on, we're going to see a bit of a shift within the community and within how we are working on all of these things. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later too, because I think it's really interesting to see how this whole concept of autism spectrum disorders is truly something that is still being altered and edited in real time. Which leads me into the next area of this, which is sort of the history of ASDs, because I think it is important for us to put some context to what we're talking about today. The reality is this is an incredibly new diagnostic area. It is an infant, essentially. The first time we have any real indication of even the word autism is 1910. So we're talking about less than what, if my math serves me right, 115 years, right? A little less than 115 years at this point. It is brand new. By comparison, for what it's worth, we have the first written evidence of Down syndrome being recognized from Egyptian papyrus from, I think it was like 200 BC or something along that timeline. So there are other diagnoses that exist that we have had a far longer history with than autism. And so this is still new. We are still learning. And the history of that really shows itself. And because we are in a time in the world where technology and information is shared so quickly, we can get bombarded with a lot of information. And so we're going to talk about some of that as well. But back to 1910. This gentleman, whose name I am not going to pronounce correctly, so I'm not going to try. He uses the word autism for the first time. And it's the very first documentation of this. And then we start to move forward a little bit, but not very quickly. Then we have Leo Kanner, and he identifies a child with some of the symptoms that were identified in 1910 as well. And then in 1943, he publishes I think it was just an article, but it cites parental warmth as the cause of autism. And we're going to talk about what actually we think causes autism and what are some risk factors. But there's a lot of history here that really needs some good, honest conversation. Then we move forward to a little bit closer to the 50s, which is Hans Asperger. And he publishes a paper that really differentiates autism and childhood schizophrenia, as it was known at the time. And he also says that parental warmth has nothing to do with this. He doesn't think it's all appropriate that we look at that. And then in 1964, we start to have some conversations about a biological component to all of this. And the first National Society for Autistic Children was formed in 1965. And the very first time we ever see it within the DSM is in 1967. And back then, it was just classified as a syndrome of schizophrenia or a subset of schizophrenia. And so it becomes really, really interesting when we think about 1967 was the first time that this was even the beginning of a diagnosis. So when we talk about things like prevalence rates, which we're certainly going to get to, we have to be aware that because this diagnosis is still new, we are going to see some rapid shifts in our diagnostic rates. Not that this alone is responsible for that. But 1967, it's the first time it's even a diagnosis. When you think about that, that's really not that long ago. Some of us might have been alive during that time period. And it also explains how when you are looking at the individuals that you work with, especially individuals who are 40, 50, 60 years old, they may not have this diagnosis at all, regardless of whether or not they would meet diagnostic criteria, because it didn't exist or it wasn't common. What we saw back then were more diagnoses along the lines of a developmental disability or an intellectual disability that wasn't differentiated any further than that. So then in 1967, we also have Bruno Bettelheim also focuses on the idea of refrigerator mothers, and we will talk about that. Kanner comes back in 1969, and he's like, no, I really didn't say that about it. It was the parents' fault for all of this, but the words are there. In 1972, we have our first real work on sensory needs, which I think is very, very interesting. And I know Danielle and I were talking before the presentation. This is an area we'd like to try and get some presentation material together for, because sensory needs are something we're seeing a lot of. And then things really seem to pick up, right? But think about it. This is 1972. It's still relatively young. Autism doesn't even become its own disorder until 1980, and it doesn't even become a special education disability category until 1991. So really, again, look at the individuals that you are working with in their age, and that may be why they don't necessarily carry the diagnosis. But we've already talked about how important the diagnosis is or isn't and what it really gains access to. And even since then, there have been tons of changes to autism criteria. 1980 was when the DSM-3 was written. We now are at the DSM-5, and it has radically changed, radically changed. So looking at those old criteria to the ones we have today, we wouldn't necessarily even recognize those criteria. I don't have the date here, and I don't know why. I need to make a note for myself and edit that next time we give this presentation. But Temple Grandin is a woman who is an incredible national speaker. There was a movie made several years ago about her life. And she is someone who is a prolific author as well, but she published a book called Thinking in Pictures. And she really gave people a ton of insight into what people on the spectrum might be experiencing, what it is that life feels like and looks like and is like for them. So I strongly encourage everyone to go either see the movie about her life. It stars Claire Danes, it's pretty good. To see Temple Grandin speak if you can. There's lots of YouTube videos too. She's a really, really interesting person. Carly, I agree, it was a great movie. She's a very interesting person, and the work that she has done outside of bringing awareness to autism has actually been really interesting as well. It's about livestock and humane ways to care for livestock, but it's really interesting. She's a wealth of information. So now I want to get to a time period that I have very strong feelings about. But that's in 1998. There was a British gentleman named Andrew Wakefield, and he published a paper citing that vaccinations overcaused autism. I am not going to mince words about this particular individual and what this paper did, but the reality is this: he has lost all respect within the medical community because he faked his data. Point blank, he lied. And so many, many studies have attempted to replicate what he said he originally found. No one has ever come close to showing that there is any information whatsoever that indicates that vaccinations cause autism. So it is pretty much a scientific fact at this point that vaccinations do not cause autism. And what I think is the worst part about all of this is because one man lied, and everyone was, of course, so hopeful that we had found one easy way for us to modify something to keep people safe from this, right? Or to make people not have this particular diagnosis, that everybody jumped on this as being a really fantastic thing. And it was just a lie. There's no other way to say it. And so billions of dollars of research funding has gone into trying to replicate his study, as opposed to going into therapies and understanding better how to work with autistic people so that we can actually help them live the best possible lives that they deserve, just like the rest of us. He continues to be active within the field. He has a number of people who still support him. None of them are within the scientific community, but he's someone who from behind the scenes is involved with a lot of different groups. And if you search, you can find which ones he is involved in. And they oftentimes push very fringe, harmful therapies and expensive therapies that have incredibly low rates of efficacy. So it's unfortunate that he is still out there, and that it is easy to sort of get duped by some of the promises that people who work with offer, because they sound really great. In 1999, we start to have states actually reporting the number of cases or instances of autism and seeing a pretty significant rise. Now, again, I think it's important to look at the historical context of some of this as well, right? We've already discussed autism was still a relatively new diagnosis. It wasn't even a special education criteria until 1991. So it would make sense that by the time we hit 1999, we would see a really incredible increase in this, because we start to have tests that can better identify it. Schools start providing the testing as well. But one of the really great things that we've gotten all of this is we are starting to get more information out there, more awareness, more acceptance, and better therapies. And it is a conversation that is evolving even today. And this next area is something that is happening in real time today. And it's a bit of a shift for all of us. It's still one that I'm still trying to work on, because I keep saying things incorrectly and I'm trying to do better. But we need to have a conversation about language and symbology related to this community, because it's very, very important. The first piece here, and this one is rough for me. This one is really hard. It's very different than what I'm used to, but there's a big conversation going on right now about whether or not we should be talking about someone in terms of person first language or calling people autistic people or an autistic person. And here's where it gets dicey, probably for most of us, if not all of us in this presentation, is the very strong preference, and I mean strong preference of individuals themselves is to be called an autistic person and not a person with autism. And I'm going to explain why, and there may be some people that you know who feel very strongly the other way, but when we are looking at the individuals themselves, the people themselves, yes, Steve, 100%, that's the whole point of all of this, is you should ask people, but it's really interesting. The more adults we have conversations with and really open those doors to talk to the people with the diagnosis, the more we are seeing autistic person. That is what people want to be known for. And here's some of the reasons that I'm seeing this. And at the end, I have some resources with some articles for this, because I do think it's a pretty radical shift in terminology. Because in this field, we're so used to talking about person first language and why that's important. But here's why in the community, in the autism community, people are very strongly starting to move towards being called autistic people or an autistic person as opposed to a person with autism. So what we are seeing consistently is people are telling us that by using that person first language, what we are actually doing potentially is treating autism as if it is a disease or a problem, something that can be cured, or that the person themselves needs to be fixed, right? So that sucks, right? Those ideas behind why that communication is so important kind of sucks. How many of us would want to be known as someone who needed to be fixed or changed or altered, that we weren't good enough? None of us would want that. So by acknowledging that that person has autism, right, that they are an autistic person, it doesn't take any of that other stuff with it. It just says that you are someone and this is a part of who you are. It's a big part of who you are. And so what we're seeing, especially with parents who are strong advocates of this and individuals themselves, is that yes, autistic people, and I will say this wrong consistently, I have to correct myself constantly. It is very, very new, even for me. We need to work with autistic people and in bettering their communication skills and then changing our way of communicating as well, right? We have to find that middle ground when we're all coming together and working on sensory challenges, but autistic people don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with them. We need to just modify how we're all behaving a bit, right? Autism is a part of someone's neurology. It's how their brain is wired. So you can't fix neurology. There's nothing wrong necessarily with neurology. It's a part of who they are. And that's okay. It also, the whole idea of the person with autism versus autistic person is that it's an idea that the person can be separated from their autism, which just simply isn't true. You can't separate a person from autism any more than you can separate someone from any other major aspect of who they are that cannot be changed. So this terminology is a little bit different. So it's interesting. You know, if you are working with individuals who have the diagnosis, who want and can have a conversation and express how they feel, Adrienne, I completely agree with you. We should talk to the person and ask how they would prefer to be addressed. I think in general, we should just do that with people. It's just a nice thing to be able to do. It seems like bare minimum, right? Sort of at rock bottom of what we all should be able to do. But you might know, it might be important for you to understand that there is a big trend for people to want to be referred to as an autistic person as opposed to a person with autism. And when we've really seen this come to life is when all these incredible advocacy boards and research boards, they started to open their doors to actually having autistic people be a part of the conversation. Most of these boards up until the last couple of years did not include individuals from that community within all of their conversations. And people started to say, now, wait a minute, shouldn't we actually have autistic people be a part of this conversation? They're the people ultimately who benefit the most from therapies, who are the ones that are the most in touch with what's going on. We're not the experts. They are. We need to have them as part of this conversation. And so as we are starting to do a better job of including autistic people, we are seeing a real shift in that communication, which is really interesting. And again, seems like the bare minimum of what we should be able to do, right? Include people to the conversation who are the ones who are the most impacted by this, who have the most expertise, which is definitely not me. And then the other thing is this puzzle piece symbol. And if we are looking at this from a marketing, branding, PR perspective, man, that puzzle piece has been fantastic. You can see the puzzle piece symbol just about anywhere. And I think all of us probably immediately have that recognition of this is about autism. But there are major caveats to this that I think are really, really interesting. The first thing is that when we talk about the puzzle piece, the word itself, puzzle, it implies that someone is shrouded in mystery and confusion. The person themselves might be confused, and that's not fair. That person might not be confused. We don't know. The next is that puzzles are sort of like problems. And what do we do with problems? We try and solve them. So the implication is that we are trying to solve people who carry the diagnosis, and that's not appropriate either. The third area, and this I think is what's really interesting too, is that so much of this marketing and so much of this PR has been utilized for resources that are for children only. And the reality is this, regardless of who you are and what diagnosis you carry, odds are you grow up and you become an adult. And when you become an adult, you are less likely to want to play with something like the puzzle piece that we see here. Even if you have a significant intellectual disability, you may not be as interested in puzzles anymore. It's a small part of the population that is. And so the puzzle piece symbol also implies that this is a childhood only situation. It doesn't represent anyone who's an adult. And the life expectancy of autistic people is the same as everybody else. And so if they grow up, they get old like the rest of us. That symbol doesn't really work for the entire age range of the population. And I think one of the things that hit me the hardest when I heard it at first was that by implying that someone is a puzzle, and the piece symbol specifically, is that there's something in them that is missing. That there's a part of them that is gone. And that's horrible. It's just a horrible thing to sort of think about, that could be what someone is saying to you, is like, oh, there's something with you that's wrong or missing, and we got to fix this. And, you know, this is only something we're going to work on with kids. And man, you're a mystery. I don't know. Every bit of that is harsh. Every bit of that sucks. Nobody would want to be told that. So what we are seeing is these changes in conversation. And like I said, from a branding perspective, my gosh, the puzzle piece has just been a boon for all of us. But it's really a symbol that at this point, people are moving very strongly away from, and we haven't found something to better replace it. And I don't know that we necessarily need to replace it in the sense that there's an overarching symbol out there that's going to be the best one. But there's a lot of conversation about both of these areas that I think is important. And I think it's good for us to have these conversations and look at where things are moving. Because again, we are living in a very dynamic world where there are constant changes and new information. And so I think it's really important for us to be aware of these things and do our best to keep up to date, knowing full well that everything I have said today could change tomorrow. And that's just how it is, right? But having these conversations and being aware of them and actually talking to people and asking them, would you prefer to be known as a person with autism or an autistic person? Those little conversations can go so far to building rapport, to helping people feel as if they can trust you and actually open up and tell you what their experiences are like. It's really important. Next, I want to cover some some myths and some facts about ASD, because it's really important for us to have some information about what is real and what isn't, because my goodness, the internet is just full of all sorts of stuff out there that isn't true. The first one is that autistic people prefer to self-isolate. Here's the reality. Some people will have impaired social skills and may have different social skills, but it's not that people don't want to interact. They may just not have the right skill set to be able to do so in a way that is considered typical. I worked with a young man years and years ago, and he sat at the same lunch table every single day with a group of other young people. They were all little girls. And at one point in time in his lunchroom, for whatever reason, goodness knows, I can't remember why at this point, but they separated all the boys on one side of the room, all the girls on the other side of the room. And it was meant to curtail some type of behavior, I'm sure. And this little boy really started to struggle during lunch. He was very unhappy. And while he didn't necessarily have great verbal vocal skills to tell us what it was that he was feeling and experiencing, we just were able to tell, like, lunch, which used to be one of his favorite times of the day, no longer was. We were able to figure out eventually that he missed his friends. He was able to give us just a couple of words that were just enough for us to put together that he missed sitting with his friends. Had you watched him in the lunchroom, you would have never put together that he felt that those young ladies were his friends, because he really didn't speak to them or interact with them in any way that we would consider to be a more quote unquote typical friendship. But those were his friends. And as soon as we were able to work with the school to work on the actual behavior and not just, assigning seats during a lunchroom situation, we did really, really well. And he was much happier at lunch. And we started really working with everyone to understand his skills a bit better. It was great. And we worked on some social skills with him, particularly in the lunchroom, because the lunch table that he sat with was just a group of really fantastic other people who were willing to just accept him and love him for exactly who he was, which was really nice. Myth number 2 is that autistic people can't learn social skills. And that is absolutely incorrect. Absolutely incorrect. People on the spectrum are absolutely capable of learning everything and anything. It may, depending on their skill set or their difficulties, it might take a little longer. They might need more repetitions. But the idea that someone can't possibly learn anything is just, it doesn't make any sense. If that were the case, then people would be exactly the same people they were the second they came out of the womb. Everyone is capable of learning. It just sometimes requires a bit more specialized instruction and training. Myth number 3, ASDs get worse. I'm really struggling with words today. Candy, it's really interesting, right? It's a bit of a shift. But ASDs get worse as people get older. And that's just simply not true. If we are working appropriately with people, they will in fact improve. This isn't something like dementia. Yes, Eric, exactly. But this isn't degenerative. It's not like dementia where we're suddenly looking at, okay, what are the most important skills for this person to learn because we want them to keep the most important things. It's not degenerative in any way, shape, or form. ASDs do not run in families. I said earlier, we don't know 100% the cause of autism, but we do know that there's a genetic component. And so the reality is ASDs do run in families. We're seeing some pretty strong correlations. And research and information on gene therapies, as well as genetic conditions and where they come from and what parts of the genes are activated, how and why, we're still learning. Myth number 5 is that all autistic people have savant skills. I don't know that everyone knows what a savant skill is, and I don't want to assume, so I'm just going to explain it. If anyone has ever seen the movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise, Dustin Hoffman plays an individual that today we would know as someone who is autistic, and he has an incredible skill set for counting cards. And Tom Cruise's character is a bit of a not so great human being, and so he takes his brother to, I want to say it's Vegas. It's been a while since I've seen the movie, but anyway, he takes him to casinos, and they start counting cards and making just a ton of money, right? And so he's taking advantage of this really, really, really specific skill set. The reality is savant skills are incredibly rare, incredibly rare. I have known hundreds, if not thousands of people that we would say were on the spectrum. The reality is I have known without a doubt one person who had savant skills. And then there was another person I worked with years ago, his family said that he had them. I never saw them though, so I'm not really sure whether or not they existed. Sorry, I'm reading a comment that Amy put in the Q&A. Amy, if you could do me a favor and put that in the chat box, that would be awesome. I'd love for everyone to be able to see that. Yes, I'm making an assumption your name is Ryan. I think the preferred language could be related to general societal shifts, absolutely. There could be some of that because we are talking a lot more about questions and asking those questions of individuals and what it is that fits them the best, what it is that they want to be known by. But SMART skills are super, super, super rare. They are not in any way, shape, or form common, and they are no more common in this specific population than they are in any other population. Myth number 6. Oops, hold on. Myth number 6. There are certain programs that actually cure ASD, and there is no cure. There is no cure. Angelica, if you would do me a favor and go ahead and just type your question in the chat box, I can get to you that way. There's no program that cures it. It is a lifelong condition. But the reality is there are a number of symptoms and therapies that can really help and make that person's life easier and help them navigate the world much better. Myth number 7, autistic people are very similar. Absolutely not. We are all individuals. It'd be like any of us looking at one another and saying, okay, every person who has, brown hair and brown eyes like I do is exactly the same. No, I said it earlier, and it's just the truth. If you've met one person with autism, you have met one person with autism. And even then, we need to change that language potentially. If you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Myth number 8, if you have ASD, you will not have any other disorder, and that is just simply not the fact. Okay, it is not a one size fits all or catch all. There are many other conditions that may co-occur. Myth number 9 that I can't get the slides to behave the way I'd like them to. Myth number 9 that I think is very important, very, very important, particularly in the population that we are working with, is that autistic people, the myth is that autistic people are more prone to violence and aggression. And the simple fact is absolutely not. They are not inherently more aggressive than anyone else out there. They have potentially a number of difficulties that make their lives more difficult, that make them harder. They may not be able to communicate as well. So they may become aggressive, but they're not more likely to be aggressive than anybody else. So let's talk about data for a little bit. And I'm looking at my time, recognizing I need to talk a little faster, or certainly work through some things a little faster so we can get to the stuff that I think is the most helpful in this. But the data for adults is really lacking, unfortunately. But I think that goes back to the fact that this is a relatively new diagnosis and it is changing criteria all the time. Now, that being said, we are seeing, according to the CDC, the most recent information is that approximately 2.21% of adults in the United States are people who have the diagnosis. Consistent with school-age children, which is where we get the most of our data, is that prevalence is highly, highly, highly more likely in men than it is women. And what we are seeing is that typically the ratio of men to women is 4-to-1, which also points to a potential genetic component to all of this. You can look through the rest of that data at your own leisure. I think what's interesting here is when we're looking at the rates of the diagnosis in children, we are seeing pretty significant changes. And this data is actually outdated already. But if we look at the 1970s, we will see 1 in 10,000, all the way to this graphic, which shows 2020, the most recent estimates are 1 in 54. And I think, like I said earlier, it's important for us to look at all of this information and put some historical context to it. That being said, all of that historical context, I don't think really hits why there's such a drastic rise in the diagnosis. So I think it's interesting, but is it the cause of all of it? Absolutely not. And in fact, the CDC relatively recently, I want to say within the last month and a half or 2 months, actually changed the prevalence rates again. And I couldn't find a great little new graphic, but the new rate is actually 1 in 36. So approximately 1 out of every 3 people could meet the criteria for the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorders. And so here's the bottom line for me. Regardless of whether or not you believe in the rates and whether or not they should be that high, or if autism is in fact a diagnosis versus any other historical diagnoses, the bottom line is this: we are in the adult world going to see this particular diagnosis far more often than we used to. And so we have to adjust. We have to start to learn these things so that we can be better advocates and providers for the individuals that we are privileged enough to get to serve. So let's talk a little bit more about ASD. You might have impairments in socialization, difficulties with making friends. They might appear withdrawn or very passive if they're just not interested in those skills. You may have impairments in communication, in very uneven expressive and receptive language. So you might be working with someone who, while they are not able to vocalize or verbalize a lot of what they are experiencing, if you speak to them, they understand everything that you're saying, right? So it's very important staff don't talk about the individuals in front of them. But you'll see a number of different ways of communicating. You might see people that are non-vocal, non-verbal. You might have individuals who use gestures. They might do motor imitations, well, all the way to verbal skills. One thing that I think we're going to see a lot more of in the adult world as things go along is a lot of individuals with AACs or ACCs, augmented communication devices, iPads and other things like Dynavoxes, where they're able to utilize those to really get what they want and need expressed because those verbal skills maybe aren't present for them. You might see some stereotypical behaviors, things that are very restrictive and or repetitive in nature. And we're going to hit all of this a bit harder in a minute. Cognitive skills, someone's measured intelligence. The reality is you might have people all the way from severe to profound intellectual disability to people who are gifted. And as I said earlier, ASD is in no way, shape, or form dependent upon someone's intellectual skill set. You also might see some sensory needs as well. And those, just like the rest of these, can really vary in intensity and manifestation over time. So you might have people who are overly sensitive to things or people who need intense stimulation in order to experience the same sensory experience that anybody else would have. And you might have someone whose motor skills are super awkward or super coordinated. So really, it's a little bit of everything. So let's talk about social skills a little bit more in depth. You might have individuals who you think have a lack of attention or awareness of others. An absence of joint attention is something that within sort of that classical definition of autism that you will see. So if you are having a conversation with someone else, you can both pay attention to the same things. Like say, for example, we were all in a room together and I said, oh my gosh, look at that truck that just drove by. We could all turn and look at the truck. Someone on the spectrum might not. They might be really engrossed in what it is that they're doing and they're not interested in what it is that we have going on. They might have fleeting eye contact or lack of eye contact. I want to be very cautious about that, though. I think this is an area that we have really altered how we're handling in the last 15 years. And I'm very grateful for it. We used to see a lot of individuals in the school system have specific goals to maintain eye contact for X number of seconds. And here's the reality. Maintaining eye contact with anyone for any significant period of time, even 5 seconds, can be super awkward and weird and uncomfortable. And so we are really moving away from being so concerned with eye contact. I've worked with a lot of people who may not necessarily look you in the eye, but they are in fact paying attention to you and they are in fact doing what you ask. That eye contact, it's for us, it's not for the other individual. So eye contact really isn't as important as it used to be, but it might be an indicator of potential spectrum. It can be very, very difficult for individuals to understand the emotions of others or take that person's perspective. Putting themselves in someone else's shoes is a very hard thing. And they might be very rule driven and have a lack of flexibility. And another one too that is interesting because it's very, very individualized is they may prefer limited to no physical interaction. Some individuals have talked about how when someone touches them, especially when it's not something they are prepared for or something they have initiated, it feels almost like they're being stabbed when someone touches them. And so they don't want physical interaction. And frankly, that makes perfect sense. If that's how it felt every time someone touched you, is did it hurt that badly? I wouldn't want people to touch me either. So a lot of times we'll see people don't want interaction, or if they do, it's only when they've initiated it or it's on their terms. And then sometimes when they get excited or have big emotions, they may want intense physical interaction. They may want squeezes or handshakes or something that get really intense in nature. Some communication differences that we might see is that it's hard for people to imitate and then also interpret facial expressions, or they may assign a particular meaning to a facial expression that isn't in any way, shape, or form what it is that you're trying to convey. I often work with individuals where I have to tell them if my face gets red, because it gets red a lot, It has nothing to do with the emotions that I might be feeling at that moment. So, we can't make any sort of assumption that I am angry or mad or sad or happy or whatever. It could just be that the temperature changed just enough for me to start to get red faced. It happens. Sometimes their facial expressions don't correlate to emotions either. There are lots of individuals that I have worked with who might be engaging in some significant maladaptive behavior and laughing or smiling. And it may not be that they're actually happy. It might be that that's the best they can do in that moment. Language is very literal at times. So if you were to be working with an autistic person and say, it's raining cats and dogs, they might go to the window and honestly, legitimately expect to see cats and dogs falling from the sky. Language is very, very literal. Idioms don't work for them. Sarcasm, especially, is rarely understood because sarcasm inherently is the tone of voice and your words not matching whatsoever. And so how is someone supposed to differentiate which they're supposed to pay attention to? So humor can be difficult, but sarcasm in general, my goodness, it's just a no-go, which is hard for me. I speak fluent sarcasm. So I have to really be conscientious about that. I've only worked with a couple of individuals over the years that I felt like sarcasm worked really well with them and they fully understood it. So I would say try and avoid that as much as you can. Pragmatics, things like turn taking in conversations, not necessarily their strength. Yes, Ellen, 100% Sheldon. I've never even watched that show, and yes, I know, yes, Sheldon, 100%. Someone's voice tone and volume are not often typical, so you might have to remind them to alter their volume or their tone, or just ensure that what you are interpreting with their tone and volume is in fact how they are feeling. Abstract concepts are difficult to understand. And they might have a really hard time with social cues, especially the ones that are nonverbal. You might have to specifically say to someone, and it sounds a bit harsh, but you might have to say, I have 5 minutes, and at the end of 5 minutes, I need to go, as opposed to us doing the Midwest goodbye, where it's 45 minutes later, and we've slapped our knees 7 times, we've headed to the door, and we can't do that. It doesn't necessarily work. Behaviors. I want to be very clear about behaviors. Individuals on the spectrum, their behaviors are not all that different from a lot of ours. They may look a little different, maybe more intense, but they aren't different. And give me just a second, we'll talk about that. Autistic people prefer routine and predictability, but to a certain extent, we all do. If you work in an office and you go to that office every day, odds are you probably take the same route to work every day. And if there's construction or you have to alter that route for whatever reason, it can throw you off because suddenly you have to think about, do I need to leave earlier? Do I need to put in for time off? Oh gosh, there's construction. I don't know how long it's going to take me to get to that particular location. So we all have those preferences. But they also might have a bigger difficulty understanding that those preferences and those routines can't always be respected in the way that they would prefer. You might have some motor stereotypies, and I feel like this is one that is very visual in the sense that you can recognize it, especially if you happen to just be out in the community and see someone. But you might see some motor stereotypies like rocking, people rocking back and forth, twirling. What is commonly known as hand flapping is sort of this motion, right? Steve, toe walking is something that I have heard over the years is potentially associated with ASD. I've also heard it associated with people who have ADHD perhaps as well. And then also people whose calves are just really tight, or that's how they prefer to walk. I've known many people who toe walked who did not have autism. So I don't think it's 100% correlated by any stretch. But you may see people who walk exclusively on their toes, right? So their calves are always flexed. People on the spectrum might have very specific areas of interest with a very limited willingness to deviate. And sometimes that can also be that those interests aren't necessarily biologically age appropriate. They might have an absence of spontaneous interest in activities. So they're not necessarily people that you can say, okay, it's free time, go ahead and do whatever you want, because they have a hard time initiating those tasks. And they might have a lack of pretend play, which is very interesting. That's something you typically are going to see more often in really little kids. That kind of sticks out. Most little kids can get in front of a play kitchen set and imitate what they see family members doing or caregivers doing. People on the spectrum may not actually do that. They may not really understand that those items are representative of a kitchen. If it's not a real kitchen and it's not the real stuff, they don't care. A lack of imitation of behaviors or noises in others. Those are other things you might see. Forms of repetitive behavior. There are lots of them, and they're all going to be different for different people in different settings, but we talked about hand flapping a little bit, head rolling and rocking. I worked with a young lady for a number of years who she would roll her head left or right, and if she was rolling her head, oh boy, I can't remember which way it is now, but if it was left, everything was good, no worries, but if she rolled her head right, she was starting to get agitated, so that was your moment to intervene before the more explosive behaviors would happen. You might have some compulsive behavior, arranging objects in stacks, lines, etc. Now, I want to be clear that it is not to say that autistic people have OCD. Those are two radically different diagnoses. They can happen together, but sometimes compulsive behavior just keeps your life organized. How many of us put our clothing away in the same locations every time we wash our laundry, right? All of my pants go in this one section, all of my shirts go in this one section. That could technically be considered compulsive, but does it impede with my life? That's where that line goes in between compulsive behavior and behavior that's closer to potential OCD. Is it impacting that person's quality of life so that they can't have a quality of life? And we'll talk about that in a minute, because a great example of someone whose life was radically impaired, and also her housemates as well. Might have ritualistic behavior. So people that have to do things, truly have to do things in the same way every single day. Some of those things are totally typical depending on the person. Most of us probably have a hygiene routine either in the morning or in the evening or both that we perform the same way, or typically the same way every night. That's completely fine. It ensures that you actually do in fact wash yourself and brush your teeth and brush your hair, right? Some of that is just great. Self-injury is something we do see quite a bit. And some of that could be related to communication difficulties as well. If you don't have the ability to express what it is that's hurting, you might start poking at that area. You might start hitting yourself. We use the example a lot of if you have a toothache, one of the first things that most of us probably do is start to press on our jaw or where it hurts. I get headaches from my allergies or migraines every once in a while. And man, as soon as I get a headache, I'm rubbing on my temple. That isn't technically self-injury, just the rubbing, but you can imagine that it would go from rubbing to this is where the pain is, let's scratch and get rid of the pain, right? And that can become self-injury. Repetitive behavior can also just be a sameness, a resistance to change. And again, some of that is just normal. Change isn't usually fun for most of us, right? So a resistance to it, that makes sense to me. Sensory differences. I'm not an expert in this area. I'm not an OT. So I know a little, but just enough to know that I don't know a whole heck of a lot. But there might be ways that people want to be touched. And I'm talking about social appropriate touch, right? But it might be very specific to them. They might have very strong clothing or food preferences, and especially texture or smells, right? And we all have that as well. I strongly prefer what I would consider to be clean smells, things like lemon. But I had a coworker years ago who absolutely hated anything lemon scented. So we just didn't have lemon scented things. No worries, no big deal. But if you can't tell someone that's what's going on, it can be a problem. I worked with a gentleman years and years ago who we were actually able to figure out that when he was working with one specific staff member, and she wore a specific perfume, he had behaviors. And did it give him a headache? Did he just not like it? I don't know. He never could really tell me that. We were just able to look at the data and figure it out. But we were able to get that staff eventually to stop wearing that perfume, and the behaviors decreased. And so everybody won, which was great. I mean, she was sad that she couldn't wear that particular perfume anymore. We just asked her to wear it not on her shift, you know. Vestibular is movement and what you might like. And so you might have people who are constantly in motion, doing lots of rocking, spinning, jumping, etc., all those kinds of things. And you might have people that might avoid all of that because it's just too much input for them. Proprioceptive is just your awareness of your body within your space. And some people are just inherently more clumsy, whereas other people are just inherently very skilled with their motor coordination. I am not skilled with motor coordination. I can walk across a room that has absolutely nothing to trip over, and yet I'm tripping over my feet. It's just me. The reality of autism spectrum disorders is this is not a condition or situation or difficulty that impairs people necessarily from living really incredible lives. It should not be viewed as a bad thing, right? Because there are many people throughout history who we look at them through today's lens or what we know of them, and we can say, gosh, there's really some pretty significant evidence here that indicates that if they were alive today, they would be someone that we would say, you know what, you're autistic, you're on this spectrum. Some of the people on this list have said that they are. Jerry Seinfeld has said that he is, and some of them certainly we are looking at through a historical lens. I think one of the ones that for me is really interesting is we look at people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, people who've ushered in this use of technology, this technology that ultimately has been so beneficial to individuals who have the diagnosis, and that many people would say that they are definitely people who would meet the criteria. And another fun fact, and just something that makes my heart happy, is Bill Gates, his company, the Microsoft Corporation, was the very first corporation, as far as I know, worldwide to offer comprehensive services to families of children that were autistic. And so many years ago, they started offering just full insurance benefits, whatever therapies your children might need, you got it, no problem. And it was actually really interesting to look through all of that information as well, because when you think about the characteristics of autistic individuals, particularly those who are very high functioning, very, very gifted individuals, a lot of them move to the tech field. And so when those individuals start meeting other people who are very similar to them and their little social quirks, right, are ones that are acceptable, they start to get married and they start to have children. And since we know that there is a genetic component to all of this, those children are more likely to have autism. And so then we started to see a rapid increase in incidence within that particular company. And their solution, amongst many other things, was to be like, you know what, we're going to do the right thing and help your kids. So they've really sort of led the way for insurance, which has been really incredible to see. It's nice to see that change. Early indicators. I'm not going to cover this at all because it sounds like almost everyone here, if not everyone, is working with adults or people who are a bit older, even adolescents. I think was the youngest that I think it was Clifton that you had said you work with. Most of this is for littles. You can read it at your own time, but it's for little kids that you're going to see, that you're going to really start to notice these things. Autism severity levels. Again, I'm not going to cover any of this. This is what we see typically when someone is first gaining the diagnosis, and it can help with insurance. It can help with justification of therapy hours. It is for littles, but it's good information for you to have, so it's there. So let's talk about causes. The reality is most of the things on this list have been disproven, but I think it's important to talk about what we know is not true, just like it's important to talk about what we do know is true, or what we think is true today. First one out there is genetics. We do know that genetics play a role. What role? That we don't know, but we do know they play a role. Things that we know do not play a role: maternal inflammation, nutrition, specific foods are not causes, PCBs and solvents, infectious diseases, the P, both the P's, can't pronounce them, not going to try. Pesticides, flame retardants, alcohol, smoking, drugs, vaccines, prenatal stress, too much TV and parental warmth, those things do not cause autism. And I think especially when we have people who are still sort of convinced that vaccinations do in fact cause autism, what I think is interesting is if you actually look up any of the research that's been done since then, particularly with individuals whose families have chosen to forego vaccinations for any number of reasons, incidence rates of autism are exactly the same as individuals who are vaccinated. So I think it's important to know that. One of the big ones, ooh, Ellen, I don't know. I feel like my sister mentioned that to me a while ago and I couldn't find anything on it, but thank you for the reminder. I will look up And yeah, you asked the question to everyone. I will look up the Tylenol. I don't know is the truth of it. I'm not 100% sure on that. I haven't seen any significant research on it, but I haven't been looking lately either. So I could have easily missed something. I think in general, there's just a big push, and probably always has been for women who are pregnant or people who are pregnant to be very conscientious about what they are putting into their body in general. But I'm not aware of any specific clear indicator on that. I will look into it because if that's one of the new things, I definitely want to address it in the future, because if it is a cause or we think there's some pretty significant data there, I think it's important to know, because we are going to talk about some things that we do have an idea that there's a correlation, not necessarily causation, but a correlation. Yeah, Ryan, you could be absolutely right. The difference between correlation and causation. So correlation is that two things are related potentially, not that one causes the other. So I'm trying to think, the example that I heard in like all of my psych one-on-one classes that always stuck with me is that crime rates and ice cream consumption are at their highest in the summer months. Yeah, right, exactly. Ice cream sales and murder, right? So does ice cream cause murder? Does murder cause ice cream consumption? Like, we just don't know, because guess what? It's not causation. One doesn't cause the other. They just both happen to be higher at the same time of year, right? So the Tylenol could be related to that. I don't know. I will look into it though. Thank you for asking. The one thing I do want to cover on this a little bit more, because I don't feel like I really got on my soapbox about it earlier, is the idea of parental warmth. So one of the old ideas that was out there was this idea of refrigerator mothers, and that mothers were not warm enough to their children after they were born, or had the right socially appropriate response to being new mothers, were the reasons that people ended up being diagnosed. That's bull, to put it mildly. And I don't think that we need to be putting any additional stress on new parents, or throwing anything else on the guilt pile that any new parent might be feeling. There's absolutely no correlation whatsoever. And I think particularly when that was happening, our knowledge of postnatal care for women was really, really poor. And so we weren't necessarily recognizing how much your body changes throughout that process, and how difficult it can be to have your own body regulate, and then all of a sudden this brand new human being be thrust into your arms that did not come with a manual, right? You were learning a brand new human being, all while trying to figure out what's going on in your own body. Yes, the schizophrenic mother accusation. Yes, let's throw one more thing at the ladies, right? We've got one more thing to feel guilty about, that we don't already have enough going on. Shoot, I'm not even a parent. I've got guilt over leaving my dogs when I go to work. Parents, I can't imagine. It's got to be a minefield. So we do know some risk factors, and I think that's important. And again, some of this stuff, like in 10 minutes, somebody could be like, nope, absolutely not. As of today, there are some risk factors that can increase the likelihood of potential autism. The first one is parental age being higher. We definitely see it in men. There's more and more research being done on women. I think from a societal end of things, it's interesting to talk about how women are typically now waiting until later to have children, and how much of that now is the greater level of access to higher education and opportunities outside of being a homemaker, if that's what someone would choose. And so women are having children later in life. So there's some potential correlation there. Siblings who have a diagnosis, again, there's a genetic component. People who have Fragile X or tuberous sclerosis, so proud of myself for saying that correctly. There's a higher likelihood there too. And the one medication that I'm aware of that we are seeing a higher potential level of autism with is valproic acid. And then the other one that, I'll be honest, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, because nope, not going to do it. But valproic acid is typically used for seizure control. And so you might see that mothers who have a seizure disorder don't take their medications during pregnancy, because we are seeing some level of a correlation there. Why? Don't know, but there's a correlation. And then genetics. Again, we know that genetics play a role here. Anywhere from 37 to 90% of twins will be diagnosed together. And it's very interesting. And then 15% of cases that we're seeing at this point, we're estimating are just mutations, random mutations that happen. So comorbidity, other diagnoses. We talked a little bit earlier that gaining the diagnosis of ASD doesn't necessarily open you up to medications, right? There's no medication to treat autism. But there are a lot of other comorbid conditions that it's important to be aware of, because what you might be able to do is look at some of these other conditions and say, okay, this also is something that is affecting this person, and do we need to consider the use of medication or therapies for this specific thing? One thing we see is, as more common, is OCD. Again, I am a huge proponent of being extra cautious about the diagnosis of OCD. I think because we use it in such a conversational and colloquial manner, we forget true OCD is something that truly impairs that person's life. It is not a choice. It is not a preference. It is typically compulsions and rituals that that person must, in fact, perform. They cannot stop doing it. It is not a choice. I worked with a young lady years ago who it would take her approximately 90 minutes to go through all of her routines before she could eat a meal. That's a huge impairment, right? We were able to parcel out some of those rituals and make them shorter and work with her on a couple of things related to that. But it was really, really interesting. Eric, I will cover that in just a second. Thank you for your question. The thing about her was she lived in a group home. And so everyone waiting 90 minutes for her to eat a meal was not necessarily a realistic proposition for everyone else in the house, much less for her. Poor young lady wasn't having a hot meal to save her life. And it was a very consistent ritual of cutting up her food very specifically and in a specific order. And then condiments had to be put on her food in just the right way. And then she would have to do this whole literal countdown procedure that was very intense and very loud and disruptive as well. And then finally she could start to eat. And she would eat her food in the same order every meal. And then she wouldn't drink until the very, very end. And it was one massive gulp. And it was just so intense. And that was just one of her rituals, right? That is a young lady who very clearly had OCD. It impeded her life to a point where she was not able to enjoy the food that she was eating. She was not able to function in the community so well. It wasn't so great, unfortunately. It was really tough for her and for her staff and for her peers. But we were able to work with her on a number of things. ADHD is also common as well. One that I think is really interesting and makes so much sense is depression and anxiety. If you are someone who does not have any sort of an intellectual disability, but you recognize that maybe your social skills are not what other people would consider to be typical, or you feel alone or that no one understands you, or social situations are tough for you, well, of course you might have depression and anxiety. That makes perfect sense, right? Intellectual disability is present in 75% of individuals. I think it's always interesting to look at that information and sort of put a little asterisk next to it and saying how much of that is because we haven't found the best way to communicate with those individuals, that they have a lot more to say, we just haven't unlocked it. Epilepsy is also super, super common. We don't know why exactly, but anywhere from 25 to 40% of individuals who are on the spectrum will in fact develop epilepsy. Okay. Madalena, thank you. That's really interesting. I'll do some follow-up as well and see if I can find any like scholarly articles or anything that talk about it as well. I think it's important for us to know that. Tic disorders can also be common as well because we're dealing with some stereotypy, some stereotypic movements. So the comorbidity is there. Some other areas where you might start to see some more comorbidity is tuberous sclerosis. That's pretty common. Gastrointestinal difficulties, sleep disorders, which is really, really difficult. I feel so badly for families who are struggling with this and who can't get a decent night's sleep, not just because they have children, but because their children don't sleep. Can't imagine. And looking at individuals, 70% will have at least one comorbid condition, 40% will have two or more. So it's really common to have comorbid conditions. Autism doesn't cover everything. And Eric, you asked a great question. You asked if Asperger's disorder would be considered in the same family as ASD, and it is. Asperger used to be within the DSM-4 its own separate diagnosis, sort of underneath the umbrella of autism. along with a couple of other things. They've sort of been lumped under the ASD at this point in time. So that's not a diagnosis that we should be giving out currently if people are using the DSM-5, but certainly it does fall under the same family. And typically, based on historical diagnosis, just in case anybody is curious, someone with Asperger's might be an individual who does not have an intellectual disability. That's typically what we see, or people who are extremely gifted, very, very intelligent people. They might have more difficulties with social communication and social skills as opposed to any other area. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, let me know. Okay, treatments and therapies. Let's talk about it. That's important, right? Because we know now we've got an understanding of what autism is and maybe what it isn't. How do we do the best job that we can to help individuals? That's important. So first thing, medication. Not that this is the best, it's just the first, because honestly, I think it's one of the first things that we tend to go to as a society, whether or not it's right. Medication. There are no meds approved to treat autism specifically. That I am aware of. If there's something new, let me know. I'd love to learn. But there are medications out there that can treat some of the symptomology that we are seeing, which is sometimes why we find people having such high levels of comorbid conditions, because all of those comorbid conditions we just talked about, those are the types of diagnoses that can in fact get you greater access to medications that might be what takes the edge off for an individual. So we can treat symptoms with things like stimulants, SSRIs, neuroleptics, and mood stabilizers as well. So medication is something that I think we run to it for a lot of reasons, none of which are necessarily wrong. The first is that it's readily accessible compared to a lot of other things, and it's also typically faster acting than a lot of other therapies. But I don't think it should be the only thing that we rely on. And I think we should always be thinking about, is the amount of medication that this individual on appropriate? Or are we actually just masking some of the best parts of who they are through meds? I've seen that happen. I can think of a little kid that I used to work with who I absolutely adored, and his family was always trying to find the right middle ground to have his incredibly fun personality shine through, but him actually be able to sit still for even a minute or two and 7 or 8 years old to be able to pay attention to schoolwork, because he was a little Tasmanian devil, but I adored him. And there were times where he was definitely at that point where it was like, okay, he can sit still, but that's all he's doing. And is this what we really want for him? Is this the best quality of life for him? And I think when we look at medications, we really have to be conscientious about, is this the best quality of life for this person? Or is it the best quality of life for staff or for everyone else? Because this person is just a lot. And we have to find that middle ground sometimes. It's not always easy. So let's talk about therapies. The reality is the internet has a million things out there. Truly, if you were to just do a Google search for autism therapies, I would want to put like all of the flashing red lights to be like, caution, caution, you're going to go down a rabbit hole that you don't want to go down, because most of what you will find online is probably not great. It's probably not what you're really going to be looking for. So there's lots of therapies that are advertised out there. The truth is that most of them lack any sort of empirical evidence to support their use. So when in doubt, if you see a therapy that makes grandiose promises, particularly grandiose promises that are super fast acting and very expensive and insurance doesn't cover it, not a great idea. Not necessarily something that you really truly want to put your faith and hope in. So you want to be very discerning when you're looking at those sorts of things. So therapies, they can oftentimes, unfortunately, give very false hope to families and are extremely expensive. As staff, and particularly for me as a BCBA, I am ethically obligated to share with families which therapies are in fact empirically founded and which ones aren't, all while respecting what it is that families might want to do or what therapies they might choose to use. And as I said earlier, I'm not a parent myself. If I were the parent of an autistic child, I think I'd probably try just about everything out there to see if it worked. I would be very planful about it. I would still be a BCBA because that's who I am inherently, and take a ton of data. But I think I would still probably try a lot of the things that were out there to see if there was something that really did make a significant difference, because there are certain people that as we understand them, we get to get a better feeling of what works for them. So the empirically validated therapies, the ones that we see the most success and efficacy with, and these are not without their own issues, are ABA, speech language services, and then OT and PT. There are lots of assessments that are conducted. We design interventions based on research. They are typically highly individualized as well. So they're not just cookie cutter, which is great. And the programs are very much modified as behavior changes, both behaviors that we want to see more of and behaviors we would like to see a little bit less of. One of the things that I love about ABA is that we talk about replacement and alternative behaviors as much as possible. I am not in the business of taking away behaviors and not giving people better things to replace them with. I'm always looking for what is the more socially appropriate, what is the safer behavior I would like that person to engage in. ABA in particular, if you happen to look up things about ABA online, you're going to find a lot of hate out there. Some of it very much deserved, some of it I think not. We are still a pretty new field, and there are certainly some things that have been done within our history that I would never consider doing today. I'm a big fan of consent from individuals and respecting when they tell me they are done. I'm not going to force someone to sit at a table for hours on end because it's convenient for me. Greg Hanley is doing some incredible research right now on consent and how it can make a huge difference. And he is someone that I look up to a lot. And one of the things that I do like so much about ABA is because we are a science that is evolving. I'm in a lot of groups right now where we are owning our history and really doing a good job of trying to be aware of what is being said about ABA and how we can do better and how we can say this is who we used to be and we are not okay with those things. This is not who we are now. And so these are therapies you will see often used. And a lot of these things you're already using with other individuals you might be working with, regardless of whether or not they have the diagnosis. And that's sort of the good news of all of this. Outlier therapies, the ones that you should definitely be a bit more cautious of. Things like dietary modifications and vitamin therapies, things along those lines. And why I say that in particular is these are often the ones where there's a big claim that it will cure, it will fix everything. But the reality is this, a lot of times really what they're trying to get you to do is buy some expensive supplement that you can't get covered by insurance. And if you really do a deep dive, you can't find a lot of good info. You'll have one or two customer testimonials and that's it. I think what's really important to do when you are looking at these types of things is to go see the doctors. Go see the doctors, period. Get evaluated and find out if you have a condition, something like allergies or intolerances, especially something like celiac disease, right? For a long time, there was a big kick that all autistic people should not have any sort of gluten. Well, if it's someone who you can show with data doesn't respond well to gluten, I'm all for it. But just taking everyone off of gluten isn't necessarily the best thing for everyone. We need to be conscientious. And there are a number of people who have celiac. And so we need to be conscientious of that as well. In fact, I follow someone on TikTok who has nothing to do with this. But she lives in Italy and celiac disease is actually extremely common. And so there are many, many menus where they actually specifically put allergen information and they have a ton of options somehow in Italy, where gluten is just really not a part of the culture, which is really interesting to see. So what I would say is just really be conscientious and talk to the doctors, get the testing done. There's no empirical evidence that the dietary therapies are effective without a medical evaluation and diagnosis. It really gives you a better understanding of what it is that you might need. Many of these therapies are highly restrictive, and can be harmful if not evaluated thoroughly. They will actually cause all sorts of vitamin and nutrient deficiencies in people. And in general, if any therapy out there is promising a quick fix or a cure, not likely to be super effective. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have played some game on your phone where there's an advertisement that comes up and there's some lady saying, I lost 57 pounds in 1 month. And she's standing there and it's two photos, and one is showing her supposedly in this clothing, and then the next one, the clothing is to the side and you can see how much extra room there is, and it's supposed to be the same person, and you just take this gummy and the weight just falls off. And I've seen one lately where they're claiming like Oprah is advertising it, and I'm like, no, this isn't real. But I'll be honest, again, if I were a parent, I might be tempted to look into some of this, right? Because man, wouldn't a quick fix be amazing? Right? If you could just take a pill and all of your world's and life's problems go away, wouldn't that be great? I can understand how that can be extremely appealing, but you want to be very, very judicious of those things. And if you would choose to use them, strongly recommend that you work with your doctors and get their educated medical opinions first, and then also take extensive data to see if it really does make a difference, to see if it really is actually helping anything. So we've talked about some things that aren't necessarily strengths. There might be some difficulties. Let's talk about some, I think I just said that wrong. Let's talk about some strengths now, because there are many things that we look at with autistic people that we can say, man, this is a skill set. We need to take advantage of this for them because it can make their lives better. One of the first ones is that they often have an ability to learn long routines. They're very routine oriented people, right? Let's use that to our advantage. That can be a wonderful thing. They're also motivated to repeat those familiar routines. They have wonderful long-term memory, particularly visual memory. And that they are quite skilled at focusing on activities of interest for long periods of time. Now, the other side of the coin on all of that is it can be a bit hard to get people to move away from the things they like to do, but I don't know any human who voluntarily would leave their favorite activity for their least favorite activity. It's not something that we like to do. But these are all strengths. These are all things that we can use to our advantage in trying to offer the best assistance to individuals and also to our staff, because obviously the staff piece of this is pretty important, right? How do we really help those individuals who are doing the hard DSP work day in and day out be as successful as possible? So let's talk about it. What are some things we can do? I just love this Far Side cartoon. It makes me laugh every time I see it because I think it's really important to what we do. We need to be explicitly clear on our directions. We need to use literal language, and visuals can be great. Because if you can learn simple things like first your pants and then your shoes, man, doesn't it make life a little bit easier? Okay, let's talk about communication tips. What are some things we can do communication-wise that can help? Visual scheduling. Debbie, we are definitely going to discuss visual schedules for sure. Communication. The first thing is teach communication that is functional and meaningful. I am a huge fan of language anytime it can be used. I personally, and anyone who knows me knows that I don't mind when people cuss at me. It's really not a big deal to me. It is meaningful communication. I have a mouth like a sailor. So if I'm working with an individual who every other word is the F-bomb, I can ignore it. If they are communicating with me, I can ignore that one word because I don't want to take that word away. If they only have 4 or 5 words, I'm not taking 20% of their vocabulary, 25% of their vocabulary away. I need to ignore that word. So let's teach people functional communication. Yes, no, right? If people can even answer yes, no questions, my gosh, that's huge, right? It opens up so much for them. It can make their lives just tremendous. Provide lots of opportunities, lots and lots and lots of opportunities to show those skills off, to use them and practice them throughout the day. When we are communicating, we need to slow the heck down. It can be really easy for us to get hyper-focused on the 20 different things on our to-do list in the moment, but we need to slow down when we are communicating and use very short, simple sentences. The less words, the better. Right? The more words we use, the more it's easy for someone to get confused, to get lost in all of those words and lose the true meaning of what it is that we're asking for. So short, simple sentences are definitely the better way to go. Use visual supports. And we're going to talk about some specific visuals that seem to work really, really well. And they don't just work for people on the spectrum, they work for all people. So we're going to talk about those and some ways you can sort of customize them. You also want to allow additional time for processing. I've worked with individuals who need up to 20, 30 seconds to process what you said to them. And especially when training new staff, it's really critical that we talk to staff and say, like, you need to actually count to X number, whatever it is in your head, and give that person the opportunity to respond. Because if I need 20 seconds to process what you said to me and you've said, put on your shoes, and then 5 seconds later, because you're impatient, because there's a million things going on, we've got to make an appointment, whatever it is, you say it again, I might have to reprocess that all over again. We've just started that 20-second delay over and over and over. So sometimes we really have to be aware of exactly how much time someone needs, because their lack of starting the appropriate behavior doesn't mean they're not going to do it. It might be that they just need a little extra time to do what you've asked. We also want to give very clear directions. And I think this isn't necessarily something that is natural or easy for us to do, but what we really need to focus on is asking people to do what we want them to do, not telling them to stop a certain behavior. So the example I just gave was that, someone asked me to put on my shoes. They didn't say, stop playing on your phone or stop watching TV. They told me what they wanted me to do, right? That can be really, really helpful. It's one less step for someone to process, because you're not asking them to stop something and they have to say, oh, what do I need to do instead? You've told them what you'd like them to do instead. You've given them the cue for the more appropriate behavior. Megan, you're 100% right. Yes, it's important that not only that we take time in what we're asking, but really give people the opportunity to respond. And sometimes that can be hard, right? Sometimes we think we know what they're going to say, and so we can become impatient, but we need to give them that time. It's really important to do. You're right. Behavior supports. There are lots, and we are going to talk about some specifically that I think are just good ones in general. And many of them we actually use ourselves, just in slightly modified ways. And we want to create routines for tasks. Keep it as consistent as possible, right? Using our visual and our spatial cues. We can use task lists, develop individualized daily schedules, use physical prompts. And we're going to talk a bit about physical prompts and how to use them and how to go from things that are most intense prompt-wise to the least intense. Teach tasks that prefer the correct way each time. Only one voice at a time. Social stories, but talk about those too, because I see a lot of really bad examples of social stories out there. Token economies and behavior plans. And this is not an exhaustive list of all the great things out there. This is a starting point. One thing that I want to say about all of the visuals that you are going to see today may not necessarily feel age appropriate for the individuals that you work with. And the reality is that most of this work, most of this research is being done within the school system. So they may not appear age appropriate, but the reality, the bottom line is this: these things work. You don't have to keep the visuals looking like they're meant for a child in elementary or middle school. You can change the visuals, but the actual techniques and technologies themselves work. So make them age appropriate if that's what you think the individual needs, but they work. They're working in the school system. These young children are going to age out and become adults. It will still work when they're adults. So we need to be aware of that. Visuals are excellent. I always like to say that words are like smoke. They're here and then they're gone. Visuals are forever. Yes, Debbie, we're going to talk specifically about that because you're 100% right. I'm a big fan of that as well. With our visuals, they're there forever. Now, I realize that some individuals may not like their visuals. They might want to rip them up or tear them up or crumple them up and throw them away. Maybe I don't like my paycheck. Maybe I rip it up. Does that mean I suddenly get the number that I want on that paycheck? No. Just because a visual goes away doesn't mean it isn't still there. That's why it's great to have lots of copies, have them laminated potentially or made a little bit more sturdily, or if you know that person isn't going to respond well to the visuals, having it up, but in a way that they can't readily access to go ahead and tear up, okay? So visuals, lots of them out there. You can find anything on the internet. It's great. This is one area where the internet might be a good thing. You can create, so going from left to right on my screen. The first one is actually a task analysis of utilizing the restroom appropriately. These can be really individualized, and we'll talk specifics. The next one, and this is one that I love. Yes, books made from cloth, absolutely. Yes, if that is more durable and works better and then you can wash it too, I don't have a problem with it. I think that's great. The second one is one that I really love, frankly, because I'm someone who loves to cross things off my to-do list. It makes me happy. This is great for people who might enjoy that as well, because you can go ahead and once that task is done, you just fold your little tab over and it's finished. You're good to go. And if you look at each one of those visuals really carefully, it's clear that each one is attached via Velcro. So you can change it day to day, hour by hour, whatever that individual needs. So while these things are meant for little kids, the way that it's written right now, so you've got like language arts, writing, lunch, going to the playground. For an adult, it could be morning hygiene, breakfast, bus ride to your CDS, workshop, right? Ride the bus home, whatever it is, you can easily modify it. And if someone has a special event that day, like a doctor's appointment, you can easily put that on their schedule so that they know what's going to be happening. The third one could be a list of coping skills, right? I don't like the be nice one, but you know, it could be a list of coping skills. Most of us are typically able to readily access our coping skills and utilize them. Sometimes the individuals that we work with not only need a visual, but they need reminders. There's nothing wrong with that. We can go ahead and make those things for them. So how do we customize all of this? Because the truth is, everyone is different. Nap habit, I will look that up. Ellen, you are on it today with all sorts of good stuff, lady. Ways to customize. If I were to hand any one of us a brand new laptop and ask us all to use Outlook as our email service, there are lots of little widgets and customizable things that we can do, right? Most of us would like it to look a bit differently. I personally prefer all of my little folders, then a preview of the email, then the body of the email, and then my calendar and my to-do list, or all my flagged emails. That's how I like my layout. I know people that don't want the preview. I know people that don't want the calendar. I know people that just want it to look like a to-do list all the time. Each one of us wants things slightly differently. And so visuals should not be one size fits all. We should really try and understand what it is that works best for that person. And so we can customize visuals just like we customize our own screens. In fact, there was a new Outlook update that came out the other day that changed the layout entirely. And while I didn't like it, I was on a Zoom call working with some friends on a big project that we're in the middle of. And one of them downloaded a template that had unicorns all over it. And she was thrilled. She was like, this makes me happy. I'm rolling with it. This is great. So we all customize things for ourselves, right? So the first option here is, I think it's just the so-and-so's week, right? And it's got every day of the week there listed. Each person, I'm assuming, has a different color, and then maybe just some social or doctor's appointments, things that they have scheduled. If you have someone who is a skilled reader, that might be the right thing for them. If they can handle an entire week or an entire month view, great. If they can't, you can make it smaller. The next example there is just the strips of different colors, and it sort of shows each person's schedule. I've seen this oftentimes used in classrooms. It can be really great, is you can ask the person what their favorite color is, and then use that color as their strip so that they know the green one is mine or the orange one is mine, right? This is done by week. You can do it however you want. And again, things are attached by Velcro because then you can easily customize it and change it because life changes, right? So if you have someone who wants to know what's going to happen ahead of time, which I am that person, I like having my calendar and knowing what's coming up. Otherwise, I wouldn't have shown up for this today. If it wasn't on the calendar, I would have forgotten, right? Let's say that it's some sort of an outing that is dependent upon weather. And you know ahead of time, that whole next day when you're supposed to be doing X, Y, and Z activity, it's going to rain, so you can't do it. So you come up with an alternative. You can quickly swap out the two different Velcro items for whatever it is that is right for that person, right? The new activity that you're going to have. What I also love about those two is it not only has the words written, but it has a visual. So you can customize it so that if you are someone who has some reading skills or they prefer visuals, you can do that. The visuals on that one, some of them appear to be more cartoonish. Others, like the measuring tape, that actually looks a little bit realistic. So the thing is you can find lots of different styles of pictures. You can find ones that are from a program called Boardmaker. And that was sort of the gold standard for years and years and years. And if you look at the very bottom example where it has the objects, the little pecks right above it, those are Boardmaker pictures. But you can also get pictures of the actual items, which I think is really wonderful to be able to do. So if you are working on a schedule for one of your individuals and you want to note that they're going to CDS or that they're going to their doctor's office, you can take photos of those people and those places and put them within their schedule so that it is in fact exactly what it is that they're going to be seeing. It can help a great deal. And some people really can't handle that visual representation. They almost need the actual objects. And we've done this with people too, where you've actually had full on object schedules, where if someone's, let's say their first task in the morning is hygiene and they have to brush their teeth, you will actually have set up in their schedule in a bin, in a strip, however it is that you can manage it to work for them, is their toothbrush will be laid out, their toothpaste will be laid out, their shampoo will be laid out, their washcloth for their body, right? Their body wash, whatever it is, the actual item is laid out because that's where they're at. So you can customize this kind of however you want. You can have objects, words, other visuals that work for you, right? I've had some people that their limited interest was so specific. There was one gentleman I worked with who loved the Minions. Oh my gosh, so much. It was like his favorite thing on the planet. And while it wasn't necessarily biological age appropriate, it was so motivating to him. It was something that he loved so dearly. We were able to find cartoon images of the Minions performing the tasks that he needed to do throughout the day. And that was kind of all it took. As opposed to it being a fight for him to do any of the stuff he was supposed to do, you could reference it back to the Minion's going to brush their teeth. Can you brush your teeth too? And he'd go do it. And I think those are the times when you really can have that conversation to say, you know, biological age appropriateness versus what actually works for that person. That's important to know. The number of items on the schedule. Some people cannot handle a ton. Some people can. You're just going to have to find that sweet spot for your individual. I think when in doubt, when you're first making a schedule, the more simple, the better. Not only is that just easier maybe for everyone to get used to as far as the individual themselves, but let's face it, for staff to get used to and be willing to implement too. Sometimes simple is the easiest way to start. So we can also customize tasks, and we're going to talk about that a bit too, because we can break down those steps for independence. We can chunk tasks as they become more independent and then build upon that person's existing strengths and their desires, the things that they really enjoy. Physical prompts. These are really, really important. And we use them all the time. But we want to be conscientious of always using the least invasive prompt possible and being aware of prompt dependence. So getting people to the point where they require a level of prompting every single time. And we need to be conscientious of that, because if they're able to do that skill on their own, we'd like them to be able to, right? An independent life, as independent as possible for that person. That's our goal. Bottom line, that's what we want. We want people to be as independent as possible so that they can live wonderful lives. And frankly, for staff as well, the more independent people are, the better. So when we look at a prompt hierarchy, we want to look at the things that are the least invasive and most independent. So our perfect scenario is going to be a visual prompt is all we need, right? That would be amazing. For some people, that isn't appropriate, especially when you're teaching a new task. They might need more intense prompting, and that's okay. So you might have to start with full physical prompts, which is essentially almost hand over hand, where you were doing the task for the individual. Then you might be able to go to partial physical, or maybe you just touch them on the forearm and use their forearm to move to the right spot, or their elbow, or just their shoulder, right? Modeling would be you showing someone how to do that same thing at the same time. I see modeling being really, really effective in de-escalation, particularly if you are asking someone to do something like take a deep breath. You can model that for them. Or counting. A lot of people will count to 5 to calm down, right? You can model that for people. You can model that with your hands, right? And help them count all the way to 5. You can actually say the words with them. You can just mouth the words. You can point to visual cues that say count to 5, or the numbers themselves somewhere. Gestures alone can be really, really helpful, right? If you need someone to, let's say, leave the room or go to see someone, you can make a little walking motion, right? And point to a picture and let that person know you need to go see so-and-so. Verbal prompts, we use those all the time. All the time. I've certainly, thank you, Ellen. I've certainly used some of those today where I talk about, hey, do this instead, or try this, you know, or hey, if you've got a question, don't put it in the Q&A, put it in the chat box, right? All of those things are really, really reasonable to use. And we all use them all the time. How many of us have been somewhere and we've needed to get through to a specific area and had to touch someone gently or say, excuse me, not even touching someone, right? But say, excuse me, can I get through here? And help sort of physically guide things, or even little kids, right? When you're trying to show them how to do stuff. I have 2 nephews, and man, physical prompting, I have to use that a lot with those 2 little stingers. So we always want to be conscientious about which is the least invasive prompt that is actually going to be the most effective for that person. And as soon as someone can do a task with a specific prompt, think ahead. What is the next prompt that is least invasive, right? So if someone can do something with full physical prompting, pending any sort of a physical need, right? That is going to impair their ability to do some of that for themselves. What kind of a partial physical prompt can I try instead? So that eventually we increase that level of independence. One of the next ones that we see is called a task analysis. And I see this mislabeled sometimes. So I wanted to talk about what it is and how we can use it. And a task analysis is when we break down exactly how to perform a task into the level of steps that the learner needs. And the learner can be the individual. The learner can actually be staff as well. Like if you're teaching staff how to complete a new form, right? That might be an area where a task analysis is helpful. What I would say for a task analysis is break them down into the steps that you think that person needs in order to be successful. Always have someone else perform that task based solely on your instructions, especially if it's someone else who knows that person, because then they can go through and say, you know what, I'm not sure that so-and-so is going to be able to do this as it's written. We either need to break it down further, or they're more independent than this. We don't need to have all of these steps. We can do it. We can adjust as needed and eventually chain the task to full independence. So the example that's listed here is making a peanut butter and jelly. There's a lot of different options for this. The one that is here, it's a pretty semi-independent one, the way that it's written currently. We've got subtasks 1, 2, and 3. Now, if you have someone who's super independent, you might just be able to have the 3 subtasks listed, right? The first one, gather ingredients, assemble the sandwich, serve the sandwich, and they can do it. But you might need to break it down further. And so that's when you have things like choose jelly, choose peanut butter, choose bread. You might need people that need it broken down even further than that. You might have people that you might need to tell them, go to the kitchen, open up the refrigerator door, choose the jelly you want, close the refrigerator door, open the cabinet for the peanut butter, get the peanut butter out, close the cabinet, right? You have to individualize it to that person and what works for them. And then you can, as they get better with that skill set, chunk it. I like to think about this almost like I think about when you're teaching someone to read. When all of us learned to read, or at least I assume so, most of us got those picture books that had very, very similar sounds. The words themselves were pretty simple. The pictures were a much bigger focus than the words themselves. And then eventually, as your skill set with reading increases, you start to go to chapter books with pictures, then chapter books without pictures. And then if you're someone who really, really loves to read, you might start thinking if a book is around 700, 800 pages, then that's what I want to read as opposed to a short book. This is what happens with a task analysis as well, is it starts out very, very, very divided in the sense that there's a ton of different options. And then eventually you can make smaller and smaller task analysis to maybe you have those 3 subtasks, or you just have listed on someone's schedule, make your lunch, and they're able to make good, safe choices and do that themselves. And man, isn't it great when someone can get to the point of being fully independent to either make their own meal or complete hygiene tasks by themselves or with minimal staff assistance? That's wonderful. Next things that we can look at, and man, I need to be aware of time, is shaping and chaining. And this is a super brief crash course in all of these techniques. I don't expect that anyone thinks they're an expert in any of this after the few minutes we spent on them, but shaping and chaining. With shaping, we have closer and closer approximations. So we're going to start with toothbrushing is a great example for this, right? The first time you ask a kid to brush their teeth, man, it doesn't go well, right? You might even not want to give any toothpaste initially or even put any water on the toothbrush because it's going to be a big old mess, right? So initially, the best you might be able to do is get someone to put the toothbrush in their mouth. with no toothpaste and no water. That's a start, right? That is not your long-term goal. That is your day one goal. Gradually, maybe you get toothpaste on there or some water on there, or they actually start to put the brush on all the different quadrants of their mouth, right? The 4 areas on the outside, the 4 areas on the inside, and then eventually get to the point, hopefully, where they're as independent as possible. So that shaping is starting at point A, wherever you're at now, knowing what your long-term goal is, but setting up in a planful manner how you're going to get from A to B, and making sure the person can perform the next step before you move to the next approximation to the ultimate goal. With chaining, we can go back to the example of making a PB&J. There's 2 different ways to chain, forward and backward. Forward is when you teach the task in the normal order. So for the PB&J example, oops, wrong one, sorry. With the PB&J example, let's say your first thing would be gathering your ingredients, right? So you teach the person to gather the ingredients, then they sit back and relax while you do the rest. And then in the end, what do they get? They get their sandwich. With backwards chaining, it's exactly the opposite, where you do everything and they only perform the last bit of the task. Whichever one you choose, just be consistent and make sure it's one that's going to be best for that individual, right? Forward chaining is the one that is the most natural, it's the one that we typically use the most, but backward chaining can be great too, depending on the individual. Social stories. Social stories can be awesome. I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you do not use most of the ones you find on the internet, because they contain elements that are not really what they're meant to be. These 3, just finding these 3, it was tough to find ones that really met the criteria that they should have. What social stories are meant to do is they outline the event that is upcoming and what expectations are in place. You focus only on the behavior you want the person to display. So if you to go look for a social story online, you're going to see a lot of, I won't do this or I won't do that. We don't want that in there. It should be the things you want someone to do instead, right? So the one here with the I listen at school. Actually, I don't like that one now the more I read it. But you're talking about what you want the person to do. I'm going to follow directions and listen to my teacher. I get to choose a fun activity. You're focusing on what they get to do, what the expectations are. They can be customized for the person and the event. They can be more visual. They can be more words. They can be written, combination, whatever works for that person. And how often and how quickly you introduce those to someone is completely based on what it is that works best for them. I know some people that really needed about a week or 2 with a social story, and you'd read it 2 or 3 times a day with them and they'd be fine. I know other people that you'd have to wait until you got to the specific activity and then you could go over the social story because maybe their anxiety was too high hearing about things 2 weeks in advance. It depends on the person. Token economies. A lot of people don't like token economies, and I am here to tell you that guess what? Every single one of us is on one right now. So whether or not you like them is irrelevant because your paycheck is a token economy. Super simple breakdown. The first thing that you want to do with a token economy is what behaviors do you want that person to work for? That's your target behaviors. You want to identify those clearly so that anybody can say, yes, this behavior did or didn't occur. Second thing is your type of tokens. So the example here, it shows a board with some stars on it. It could be stars, it could be stickers, it could be something that you've laminated and they just check off, right? Or staff initials, whatever, doesn't matter. Next thing is those backup reinforcers. And that is, what does that person actually get for doing the stuff that they're supposed to do? For us, we get our paycheck. Money is a backup reinforcer. Because what do we do with money? We spend it. Some of it for obligatory things and some of it, hopefully, for the stuff that we want. But a backup reinforcer is essential. Just the board itself, it's not enough. It's not enough for us just to come to work and feel like, man, we did some really good work today. We helped some people. We made their lives better. It's not enough. You need the cash, right? None of us got paid. We probably wouldn't be here, even if we love our jobs. So you want to select the backup reinforcers and you want to pick a big variety. There is no token economy that will work for any significant length of time that only has one reinforcer. Don't care. If that person only seems to like one thing, have options. Always give them a choice. Always. None of us are going to want the same thing every day for the rest of our lives. We shouldn't expect that of individuals. We also want to have a good reinforcement schedule that tells us how often they're going to get the reinforcement. The truth is, the more often someone gets the reinforcement initially, the more likely it is for us to be successful. Angie, I will address that question in a little bit. If you want to throw it in the chat box, you certainly can, but if you'd like to prefer to keep it in the question and answer, that's cool too. So with a token economy, you want to know how often is that person going to get it? And I always recommend that you start slightly lower than what the person is actually able to achieve. Because if we put some sort of intense criterion in place for that person and they never are going to reach it, they're never going to try. It's never going to happen. And then also, what is the minimum expectation for them to get the reward, the time and the place for exchange? And then the last one here is response costs, which is if they make the poor choice, what do they lose? I rarely use this, and I mean rarely. And I would only recommend that a response cost be put in place if you are trying to deter a very, very dangerous behavior. The only time I can recall off the top of my head ever using it was we had someone who was pulling fire alarms on a regular basis. And it was really, really disruptive, and it caused a lot of behaviors in the house for other people. And so if she pulled the fire alarm, she lost 2 of her stickers for the day. But she could earn like 10 a day, because otherwise then she's never going to get the reinforcement. And it worked pretty well. But I would only use it for very, very dangerous behavior, not for mild behaviors. And then behavior plans. We are very close to time, so we're good. Behavior plans. Super, super, super important, not just because I'm a BCBA, but obviously I like them because I am one. The reality is behavior plans are effective if written appropriately. They can be super, super helpful. Lots of people in my life are on behavior plans and they don't even know it, and it's great for me. I'm sure there are people in my life who have me on a behavior plan and I'm not quite aware of it, and that's cool too. First thing though is always look at the medical stuff first. Because the reality is this, is there is no behavior plan on the planet that will address a medical need. It won't happen. We want to identify the behavior to reduce, as well as one to replace it with that is more socially appropriate. Always. We have to know the function of the behavior. So we want those A, B's, and C's, antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And really, truly, out of the A, B, C's, what's the least important? The B, right? I don't need to know if someone hit versus slapped versus punched versus kicked. It's physical aggression, but I need to know what happened before and after so that I can understand why they're doing what they're doing. Target behaviors, they have to be objective and clear so that as a random human being coming into a group home or a CDS setting, I would know exactly whether or not that behavior occurred. Data collection, if it data or it didn't happen is really the best way to say it. If there's no data, I can't help you, right? It might be more intrusive and it might be more intense initially, but gradually, as staff are doing a good job taking that data, if you can give me a month of like solid, really, really good data, I can then modify the collection method so that we can actually make it easier and more reasonable for staff. But initially, it might have to be harder, you know? Goals need to be written off of behavior data, and then reasonable steps towards decreases and increases of behavior. One thing that I don't want to see in behavior plans is that 0 instances of behavior will occur. It's just not reasonable. We're all going to have a bad day. What I would recommend instead is maybe lengthen the amount of time. So if you have someone who they're engaging in a behavior once an hour, right? And you want them to get to the whole day without that behavior, okay, only one time an hour. One time every hour and 15 minutes, one time every hour and a half, and gradually increase that length of time. And that behavior plans are fluid. They are not meant to be a document that you review just once a year. Okay, ideally, you're going to do it a lot more often than that. And that's really kind of the end. If nothing else, I know we're right at time. Angie, your question. Answer if you don't mind, would you just let me know, are you okay with me reading this out to everyone or not? And then if anybody else has questions, do not hesitate to ask. My email address was at the very beginning of the presentation. Don't hesitate to reach out. If I don't have the answer, I will try and figure it out or get you connected to the right resource. Great, thank you, Angie. Okay, Angie asked what I would suggest for someone's family or friends that are not accepting of a diagnosis of autism and will not follow the plans and therapies in place for that child or adult to become successful. You've given them opportunities to educate themselves about autism, but they refuse to follow and put anything in place. Oh, buddy, that's tough. And I haven't forgotten the question earlier either about someone asking about misdiagnosis. I will get to that if you're still here. I apologize. Diagnostic acceptance is really hard. And there will be some people who will never be willing to accept it, who will never be willing to implement. And that's really difficult. There's no way to sugarcoat how hard that is, right? Because you may have all of the best therapies in mind, the best behavior plans in mind. You might actually have it in place in another setting and everything is working phenomenally and you just desperately want them to try it and they're not. Great, Rob, wonderful. I've dealt with that a lot of times, so I don't have like a quick and easy answer. I so wish I did. It would be so nice. In those moments, I truly envision the situation like a brick wall. And I try and think to myself, is there any brick in that wall? And each brick is labeled, with something, a family member or a behavior or a resource the family seem to be slightly interested in. Are any one of those bricks loose? Because you can run directly at that brick wall a million times and never make any progress. But if there's even one brick that's slightly loose, can you keep working on that one brick? And then eventually that brick comes out, right? And then another and another and another, and eventually that wall comes down. I think what's hard, I think sometimes in those moments, the best thing to do is just have a very blunt conversation with the family and say, okay, here's the 7 things we recommended. Which one are we trying first? And how long are we trying it before we say whether or not it was successful? And then depending on what your scenario is and what setting you're working in and what your rights are as the provider, if a family isn't willing to follow through with anything, deciding whether or not the services that you have to offer are what they actually want. And sometimes you do have to have a rough conversation with a family to say, okay, this X, Y, and Z is what I have to offer you. You're not interested in X, Y, or Z. I don't know that I'm the right service for you. Here are some other opportunities. Here are some other things that might work for you, but this isn't necessarily maybe what you need or what you want. Because sometimes what we have to offer isn't right for whatever reason. Maybe the family's not ready to hear it. Maybe they really, they're not accepting of the diagnosis. What we're offering them feels really intense to them, whether or not it is. I think sometimes just having that tough conversation can be really, really helpful. Because you can see, is there a loose brick, right? Is there a loose brick in this situation? Is there an area where we can make even a little bit of a difference to get some buy-in? Because that's tough. Man, those moments are rough. I mean, I feel for you, Angie. I've been there. I really, really have. And it's unfortunate because you can lead a horse to water all day long, but sometimes that horse simply isn't going to drink. And that's hard. But for me, it really is, okay, is there one area that I can make some progress in? And truly, if not, sometimes it's time for that meeting where you say, okay, this is what we have. And either we move forward or we don't, or this is what we need from you. And that's hard. Yeah, I don't know that I have anything else better for you at the moment. Let me know if that was helpful or not, or if at least maybe you felt some solidarity. At least I could provide that. And then Robin, you were asking about misdiagnosis. Let me try and find your question again, because I want to be sure that I think you were asking about whether or not trauma could be misdiagnosed. I want to be sure if it was the trauma that was being diagnosed or autism that was being diagnosed. Okay, if trauma can be misdiagnosed as autism. Oh, good, Angie, good. Okay, well, if nothing else, I feel you've been there. trauma can potentially be misdiagnosed because misdiagnosis happens is the reality of it. Without going into specifics of your situation and knowing your situation, I would want to know things like who did the diagnosis, what kind of testing did they perform, how much time did they really spend with your loved one? Because if it was just a quick conversation with the doctor, it might not be an appropriate diagnosis, or you might need more information. When it comes to getting a diagnosis of autism, I strongly recommend that you seek out the right services for that. So I'm not sure where you're at in Illinois, but one of the greatest resources that we actually have here in the state is on this slide. It's the, yes, Kristen, you're right. Sometimes psychs are giving a diagnosis of autism and not conducting testing like the ADOS. Now, the ADOS is not the only test out there. It is one of many tests. It is a great test. It is not the only test out there. And it is a test that is performed with a couple of professionals where they actually go through very specific tasks to determine whether or not autism might be present. But one of the best resources out there is the Autism Program of Illinois. They can help connect you with diagnostic services and clinics in your area that might be able to help you with that. Because, and yes, Kristen, excuse me, they're great. Sometimes psychiatric hospitals are giving you diagnosis as well. I think it's really great to go to an actual clinic that specializes in autism to get the testing conducted there. Or if you are looking for services in the educational setting, going to the actual school and requesting that testing, because an educational diagnosis of autism and a medical diagnosis are not the same thing. But I would, if you're not sure if it's one or the other, yes, Robin, please feel free. Let me type in my email address for you. Absolutely. Because if I know where you're at and things like that, I can maybe point you in some directions of resources in your area. Let's see. Because yeah, the reality is anything can be misdiagnosed. Absolutely. It is definitely a possibility. Yep, Kristen, you're right. And this whole process can be very overwhelming. Even if you are someone who is entrenched in the system. I worked with some incredible teachers over the year who will have one of their own children get the diagnosis, and they're sitting behind the table at the school meeting as not the teacher, the educator, but as like the parent. And it can feel really overwhelming, even though they know this process inside and out. It's literally what they do for a living. But yes, Robin, please feel free to email me, and I'll see what I can do to help you out and maybe point you in some directions. But yes, absolutely, things can be misdiagnosed. It does happen now and then, but let's see. Does anybody else have any other questions? If not, thank you all so much. It's weird to talk to my computer screen and not see faces, but kind of gotten used to it over the last 3 years. But I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day. And if you get the long weekend, that your long weekend is wonderful too.
Thank you so much, Katie.
Bye, everyone.